The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Adelaide Cottage as Prince William stood at his kitchen window, a steaming cup of tea growing cold in his hands. The December air was crisp, and frost still clung to the edges of the window panes. It was supposed to be a quiet Thursday morning, the kind he cherished most, no official engagements until afternoon, the children getting ready for school with Catherine's gentle guidance echoing from upstairs. His phone buzzed insistently on the granite countertop behind him. William had been ignoring it for the past hour, but the persistence suggested something more than the usual morning briefings from his private secretary. The third buzz in as many minutes finally broke his resolve. "Sir, I'm terribly sorry to disturb you so early," came the familiar voice of his communications secretary, Sarah Mitchell. Her usually composed tone carried an undercurrent of tension that immediately put William on alert. "But, we have a situation developing that requires your immediate attention." William set down his teacup with more force than intended, the china rattling against the saucer. "What kind of situation, Sarah?" "It's regarding the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, sir. Netflix has just released a trailer for what they're calling an explosive documentary. The streaming platform is promoting it as an unprecedented look inside the royal family, with Harry and Meghan making several substantial claims." The words hit William like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, feeling the familiar knot of dread that had become all too common whenever his brother's name came up in these contexts. "What sort of claims?" Sarah's pause spoke volumes. "Sir, perhaps it would be better if you watched the trailer yourself. I can have it sent to your secure device immediately. The full documentary is set to release in 2 days, but the promotional material alone is already causing significant media reaction." William's jaw tightened. 2 days. In 48 hours, whatever Harry and Meghan had decided to share with the world would be public knowledge, dissected by every newspaper, analyzed by every royal correspondent, and discussed in every household across the Commonwealth. And he would have no control over the narrative, no opportunity to provide context or correction. "Send it over," he said quietly. "And, Sarah? Cancel my morning. Clear my schedule until after lunch." After ending the call, William stood in the silence of his kitchen, listening to the familiar sounds of his family's morning routine. George's voice carried down from upstairs, animated as he told Catherine about something he'd learned in history class. Charlotte was humming to herself, probably while Catherine braided her hair. Louis was making the sound effects that accompanied whatever elaborate game he was playing with his toy soldiers. These sounds, these precious moments of normalcy, felt suddenly fragile. How many more mornings like this would they have before the documentary's revelations changed everything? How many more times would his children be able to move through the world without the added weight of public scrutiny that seemed to follow every royal scandal? His secure tablet chimed softly. The trailer had arrived. William carried the device to his study, a room that had become his sanctuary over the past few years. The walls were lined with photographs, official portraits mixed with candid family shots, images of him with his grandmother during state occasions, pictures of him and Catherine on their wedding day, snapshots of happier times with Harry from their military days and charitable work together. He settled into his leather chair and pressed play. The trailer opened with dramatic music and sweeping shots of Montecito, California, where Harry and Meghan now lived. The production values were clearly high. Netflix had spared no expense in creating something that looked more like a Hollywood film than a documentary. Harry appeared on screen first, looking directly into the camera with an expression William had never seen before, a mixture of determination and something that looked almost like pity. "When you're born into this family," Harry's voice was measured, deliberate, "you don't get to choose your role. But you do get to choose whether you'll perpetuate the cycle or break it." William's breath caught. He knew that tone, had heard it countless times during their childhood when Harry was building up to one of his more dramatic pronouncements. But this felt different. This felt calculated. The scene shifted to Meghan, sitting in what appeared to be their sprawling California garden. She looked directly at the camera, her media training evident in the way she held herself, the careful modulation of her voice. "I tried to fit into their world," she said softly. "I tried to become what they wanted me to be. But I learned that in that family, there's only room for one narrative, and it's never the truth." William paused the video, his hands trembling slightly. He'd known this was coming. There had been hints, warnings from mutual friends, carefully worded statements from Harry and Meghan's representatives. But seeing it, hearing their voices saying these things with such conviction, was something else entirely. He thought about calling Catherine, bringing her into this crisis as he did with everything else. But she was upstairs with their children, maintaining the peaceful bubble of their morning routine. There would be time enough to share this burden with her. For now, he needed to understand exactly what they were facing. The trailer continued with a montage of newspaper headlines, paparazzi photos, and what appeared to be private text messages. William caught glimpses of conversations he dimly remembered, discussions about media strategy, about how to handle various crises, about the delicate balance between supporting Harry and Meghan while protecting the institution they all served. But the context had been stripped away. The careful nuance of those conversations, the genuine concern that had motivated many of those decisions, the impossible position everyone had found themselves in, none of that came through. Instead, the trailer painted a picture of cold calculation, of a family more concerned with image than with the well-being of its members. They called it "the way things are done." Harry's voice continued over footage of various royal events. They said it was tradition, that we all had to endure it. But, watching what it was doing to my wife, watching her struggle and knowing that no one was willing to help her, I couldn't be complicit anymore. William's memory flashed to a conversation they'd had during one of the most difficult periods. He'd tried to explain the constraints they all lived under, the careful balance required to maintain the monarchy's stability while supporting individual family members. Harry had listened, but William could see in his brother's eyes that he wasn't really hearing it. Harry had always been more emotional, more reactive. He saw problems and wanted immediate solutions, while William had been trained from birth to think in terms of long-term consequences and institutional stability. The trailer showed brief clips of what appeared to be more extensive interviews. Meghan discussing her mental health struggles, but with none of the context about the support that had been offered, the resources that had been made available. Harry talking about feeling trapped, but without acknowledging the privileges and opportunities that came with his position. There were family photos too, images from private moments that William remembered clearly. Christmas gatherings, christenings, family holidays. Seeing them used in this context felt like a violation. Those had been real moments of connection and joy, but now they would forever be associated with this narrative of dysfunction and cruelty. The trailer built to its climax with Harry speaking directly to the camera. "I made a promise to my mother that I would protect the people I love. And sometimes, that means protecting them from the family that's supposed to protect them." William paused the video again, this time standing up and walking to the window. The reference to their mother felt particularly cruel. Diana's death had shaped both of their lives in profound ways, but they had processed that trauma differently. William had found strength in tradition and duty, while Harry had found it in rebellion and change. Both approaches were valid, but they had led them to very different places. The final moments of the trailer showed a montage of newspaper headlines about their family, with Meghan's voice providing narration. "They have a version of the truth, and they have their version of the truth. This is our version of the truth." As the screen faded to black, William realized he'd been holding his breath. The trailer was only 3 minutes long, but it contained enough explosive material to dominate news cycles for months. And this was just the preview. The actual documentary would contain hours of footage, detailed allegations, specific examples of the grievances Harry and Meghan had been nursing since their departure. William's phone buzzed with another call from Sarah. He let it go to voicemail, knowing that she would be fielding calls from journalists, trying to manage a crisis that hadn't even fully emerged yet. Soon, his father would need to be briefed. The palace's communications team would need to develop a strategy. His grandmother's advisors would need to be consulted, though thankfully she had been spared this particular crisis by her passing earlier in the year. But, before any of that, William needed to process what he'd just seen. He needed to understand how his family had reached this point, where his brother felt compelled to share their most private moments with the world, to present their family's struggles as a form of entertainment for millions of viewers. He thought about Harry as a child, the little boy who had walked behind their mother's coffin with such dignity, who had served his country with honor in Afghanistan, who had channeled his grief into meaningful charitable work. That Harry still existed somewhere, William believed. But, this public Harry, this man who spoke to cameras about family betrayal and institutional cruelty, felt like a stranger. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted his thoughts. Catherine appeared in the doorway, having clearly sensed something was wrong. Her expression shifted from mild curiosity to concern as she took in William's posture, the tablet in his hands, the shadows under his eyes that seemed to have appeared in the past hour. "What is it?" she asked simply. She didn't need dramatic explanations or detailed background. After more than a decade together, she could read the subtle signs of his distress better than anyone. "Harry and Meghan," William said, his voice hoarse. "Netflix documentary. It's bad, Catherine. It's really bad." She crossed the room and sat beside him, not asking to see the trailer, not pushing for details. Her presence alone was steadying, a reminder that whatever storm was coming, they would weather it together. "The children?" she asked. "Will need to be prepared," William acknowledged. "George especially. He's old enough to hear things at school, to ask questions we might not be ready to answer." They sat in silence for a moment, both understanding the implications. Their children had been largely shielded from the media attention that surrounded their uncle's departure from royal life. But a Netflix documentary would be different. It would be everywhere, unavoidable, discussed by their friends' parents and dissected on social media. "What do we do?" Catherine asked. William looked at her, this remarkable woman who had married into his complicated family with such grace, who had navigated the impossible pressures of royal life while raising their children and supporting his work. She deserved better than this. Their children deserved better. "We protect our family," he said finally. "We tell our truth when the time is right. And we hope that people can see through the drama to understand what really happened." But, even as he said the words, William wondered if that would be enough. In an age of social media and instant reactions, nuance was often lost. The most compelling narrative usually won, regardless of its accuracy. And Harry and Meghan had just crafted a very compelling narrative indeed. The emergency meeting at Kensington Palace was unlike any William had ever attended. The usual protocols seemed insufficient for the magnitude of the crisis they were facing. Around the mahogany conference table sat the most senior advisors from across the royal household, his private secretary, the communications team, legal counsel, and representatives from his father's office at Clarence House. William had spent the previous evening watching the full documentary with Catherine, both of them sitting in stunned silence as 6 hours of carefully edited footage laid bare what Harry and Meghan presented as the truth about their time as working royals. The experience had been surreal, like watching a distorted version of his own life played back to him by actors who looked like his family but seemed to be playing entirely different characters. "The response has been immediate and overwhelming," Sarah Mitchell was saying, her usual composed demeanor showing cracks around the edges. She'd clearly been working through the night, trying to manage the initial wave of media attention. Every major news outlet is running it as their lead story. Social media engagement is unlike anything we've seen since the Queen's funeral. William studied the briefing papers before him, though the numbers and statistics couldn't capture the emotional weight of what they were dealing with. Millions of people around the world had now heard Harry describe feeling abandoned by his family, had watched Meghan detail her struggles with mental health and the alleged lack of support she'd received. They'd seen private family moments recontextualized as evidence of institutional cruelty. "What's the sentiment analysis?" asked James Crawford, the deputy communications secretary who specialized in digital media strategy. "Mixed, but trending negative for the institution," Sarah replied, consulting her notes. Harry and Meghan's supporters see this as validation of their claims about racism and institutional rigidity. Those loyal to the crown are expressing outrage at what they view as a betrayal of family privacy. The general public seems split, but the younger demographic is showing significant sympathy for the Sussexes' position. William nodded, unsurprised. Harry and Meghan had always been particularly popular with younger audiences, and their narrative of fighting against outdated traditions would naturally resonate with people who saw the monarchy as an anachronistic institution in need of radical change.
What about specific allegations? William asked, though he dreaded the answer.
He'd watched the documentary, but he needed to understand which claims would require the most careful handling.
Sarah exchanged glances with the legal counsel before responding.
They're quite specific, sir. Allegations about conversations regarding Archie's skin color, claims about being denied mental health support, assertions about being deliberately excluded from family events, and personal communications that they've chosen to make public. The personal communications were perhaps the most painful aspect. Text messages between family members, conversations that had been private expressions of concern or frustration, were now being presented to the world as evidence of callousness. William remembered many of those exchanges. They'd been trying to navigate an unprecedented situation, to balance Harry and Meghan's needs with the institution's requirements. But, stripped of context and presented through Harry and Meghan's lens, they looked petty and cruel. There's also the matter of the children, Sarah continued carefully. They've included footage of Archie and Lilibet, and Harry speaks extensively about wanting to protect them from the same treatment he received. It's created a narrative where continuing royal involvement is presented as potentially harmful to his children.
William's chest tightened.
His own children had been mentioned only briefly, but the implication was clear, that he was failing as a father by continuing to participate in a system that Harry now characterized as toxic. The suggestion that William was somehow complicit in perpetuating harm against the next generation was particularly devastating. "What are our options for response?" he asked. The legal counsel, Margaret Hayes, leaned forward. From a legal perspective, most of their claims fall into areas that would be difficult to challenge.
They've been careful to present everything as their personal experience and interpretation of events. They haven't made outright false statements that we could easily refute. And, from a communications standpoint? William pressed.
Sarah hesitated. "Sir, there are several schools of thought. We could issue a detailed point-by-point refutation, but that would likely keep the story in the headlines for weeks and make us appear defensive. We could offer a brief, dignified response that acknowledges different perspectives without engaging in public disagreement."
Or, William prompted. "We could consider a more comprehensive response.
Perhaps your own interview, or a documentary that provides context for the decisions that were made. But that would be unprecedented and could escalate the situation significantly." William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where he and Harry had played as children. Those had been simpler times, when their biggest concerns were football matches and avoiding their homework. Now they were adversaries in a very public family dispute, with millions of people taking sides based on carefully crafted narratives.
"What about father?" William asked. "What's his position?"
"His Majesty is consulting with his own advisors," came the diplomatic reply. "But early indications are that he favors a restrained response. He's concerned that any escalation could further damage family relationships and potentially impact the Commonwealth realms."
William understood his father's position, but it frustrated him nonetheless.
Charles had always been more willing to accommodate Harry's increasingly dramatic demands, perhaps hoping that patience and understanding would eventually bring his younger son back into the fold. But William could see that Harry had moved far beyond the point where reconciliation was possible without fundamental changes to how the monarchy operated. The meeting continued for another hour, with various scenarios being discussed and contingency plans being developed. But William found his mind drifting to more personal concerns.
How would he explain this to his children?
George was only 9, but he was already beginning to understand his future role and the responsibilities that came with it. How could William help him process the idea that his uncle viewed those responsibilities as harmful? When the meeting finally concluded, William remained behind with Sarah and James. The others filed out quietly, each carrying their own portion of the crisis to manage. The palace machinery would continue to function, briefing papers would be prepared, statements would be crafted, but the fundamental problem would remain. "Sir," Sarah said carefully,
there's something else we need to discuss. There are indications that this may not be the end of their media activities.
Sources close to the Sussexes suggest they have additional projects in development.
William felt the weight of this revelation settle on his shoulders. This wasn't a single event they needed to weather, but potentially the beginning of an ongoing campaign. Harry and Meghan had found a way to monetize their royal connection while simultaneously criticizing the institution that had provided them with that platform. It was, William had to admit, strategically brilliant even as it was personally devastating. More documentaries, he asked. Possibly.
But also books, podcast series, speaking engagements. They've created a brand around their royal experience, and that brand requires ongoing content to maintain relevance. William closed his eyes, imagining years of this, periodic releases of private family moments, recontextualized and presented to support whatever narrative Harry and Meghan were developing at the time. Every family gathering would now be viewed through the lens of potential future content.
Every conversation would carry the risk of eventual public exposure. How do we protect the children from this? William asked finally.
Sarah and James exchanged glances.
It was the question that had no good answer, the one that kept all of them awake at night.
We develop protocols for information security, James suggested. We're more careful about what gets documented, more selective about who has access to family moments.
But William could see the trap in that approach.
They would be turning their family into a fortress, teaching his children to view their relatives with suspicion and their private moments as potential weapons. That wasn't the childhood he wanted for George, Charlotte, and Louis. After the advisors left, William sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by the detritus of crisis management, briefing papers, media monitoring reports, legal analyses. Through the window, he could see tourists gathering outside the palace gates, many of them holding phones and taking selfies. Some were probably discussing the documentary, debating whether Harry and Meghan's claims were accurate, choosing sides in a family drama that had been transformed into public entertainment. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine, "Kids are at school.
I'm here when you're ready to talk." William smiled despite everything.
Catherine had become his anchor through all of this, the one person who could see past the public drama to the personal pain underneath. She'd watched him struggle with Harry's increasingly erratic behavior, had seen him try repeatedly to bridge the growing gap between his brother's expectations and the reality of royal life. He made his way back to Adelaide Cottage, where Catherine was waiting in their sitting room with a fresh pot of tea and the kind of determined calm that meant she was prepared for a difficult conversation.
"How bad was it?" she asked as he settled beside her on the sofa.
"Worse than the trailer suggested," William admitted.
"They've essentially declared war on the institution, and they're using our family's private moments as ammunition." Catherine nodded, unsurprised.
She'd always been more realistic about Harry's trajectory than William had been. Where William had hoped for reconciliation and understanding, Catherine had recognized earlier that Harry's grievances went beyond specific incidents to fundamental disagreements about the monarchy's role and value.
"What did they say about the children?" she asked. "Not much directly, but the implications are clear.
They're suggesting that continuing in royal life is harmful, that we're failing our children by not protecting them from this system." Catherine was quiet for a moment, processing the full scope of what they were facing.
"And what do you think?" she asked finally. It was the question William had been avoiding, even to himself. Was Harry right? Were they perpetuating a system that would ultimately harm their children? Were the privileges and opportunities that came with royal life worth the constraints and scrutiny that accompanied them?
"I think," William said slowly, "that every family has its challenges.
And I think that running away from responsibility isn't the same as protecting your children from harm." But, even as he said it, William wondered if he was being too harsh. Harry's decision to leave hadn't been purely selfish, he genuinely believed it was the best choice for his family. The problem was that in making that choice, he'd also chosen to burn down the bridges that might have allowed for a different kind of relationship with his past. "The children will have questions," Catherine said practically. "Especially George. His friends at school will have seen the coverage." William nodded. "We'll need to talk to them this evening." Explain that sometimes families disagree, but that doesn't mean they stop loving each other. But would that be enough? And how could he maintain that message if Harry continued to use public platforms to criticize their family and their choices? How many more documentaries, books, and interviews would it take before the narrative became so poisonous that reconciliation became impossible? As they sat together in the afternoon light, William tried to imagine a path forward. The immediate crisis would pass, there would be other news stories, other scandals to capture public attention. But the damage to family relationships might be permanent. Harry had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, had shared private moments that couldn't be made private again. The sound of a car in the driveway announced the children's return from school. In moments, the house would be filled with the chaos of homework and snack time, of George's endless questions and Charlotte's dramatic retellings of her day. For a few hours, they could maintain the illusion of normalcy. But William knew that eventually, they would need to have the conversation he'd been dreading, explaining to his children why their uncle had chosen to share family secrets with the world, and what that meant for all of their futures. The royal residence felt different in the days following the documentary's release. There was a tension in the air that even the youngest staff members could sense, hushed conversations that stopped when someone entered a room, carefully neutral expressions from people who were usually more relaxed and forthcoming. William found himself studying faces, wondering what people really thought about the allegations Harry and Meghan had made. It was during a routine meeting with his charitable foundation's board that the personal cost of the crisis truly hit him. Lady Pemberton, who had known William since his university days and had never been one to mince words, waited until the other board members had left before approaching him. "William," she said gently, "I hope you know that those of us who've worked with you understand the real character beneath all this noise." The kindness in her voice nearly broke his composure. He'd been so focused on managing the institutional response that he hadn't fully processed his own emotional reaction to watching his brother describe their family as cold and calculating. "Thank you, Diana," he managed. "It's been challenging. I can imagine. But I want you to know that we see the work you do, the man you are. Harry's pain is real, I'm sure, but it doesn't define who you are or what you've built." After she left, William sat alone in his office, surrounded by photos and mementos from years of charitable work. Awards from organizations he'd supported, thank you letters from people whose lives had been touched by his initiatives, images from visits to hospitals and schools and community centers around the world. This was his legacy, the work that gave his life meaning beyond the ceremonial aspects of royal duty. But Harry's documentary had reframed even this positive work as part of a system that was inherently flawed. In Harry's telling, royal charitable work was a form of performance, a way to distract from the institution's more problematic aspects. It was a narrative that reduced years of genuine commitment and real impact to mere public relations exercises. William's private secretary knocked and entered, carrying the latest media monitoring reports. "Sir, there's been an interesting development. Several former staff members have reached out through back channels, expressing interest in providing their perspectives on the claims made in the documentary." William looked up, surprised. "What kind of perspectives?" "People who were involved in the support offered to the Duchess of Sussex during her time as a working royal. They feel that their efforts have been mischaracterized and would like to set the record straight." It was tempting. William knew that there had been extensive efforts to help Meghan adjust to royal life, personal support, professional coaching, mental health resources. But those efforts had been confidential, and the people who had provided them had maintained their discretion even as their work was being publicly criticized. What would that involve? William asked. They could provide statements, possibly participate in background briefings for journalists. Nothing that would violate their professional obligations, but enough to provide context that's currently missing from the public discourse. William considered it. The narrative that was emerging in the media was largely one-sided, based on Harry and Meghan's perspective without input from the many people who had worked behind the scenes to support them. But authorizing current or former staff to speak publicly would represent a significant escalation, a departure from the traditional royal approach of maintaining dignity through silence. "Let me think about it," William said finally. "And let me discuss it with Father first." That evening, William found himself in an unusual position,
calling his father to coordinate their response to a family crisis. Their relationship had always been complex, shaped by the unique pressures of their roles and the tragedy of losing Diana when William was still so young. But, in recent years, they developed a mutual respect and understanding that had been tested by Harry's increasingly public criticisms. "It's a difficult position, William," Charles said when they spoke. His voice carried the weight of someone who had spent decades managing public scrutiny and family drama. "If we respond too forcefully, we risk appearing defensive and keeping the story alive longer than necessary. But, if we remain silent, we allow their narrative to become the accepted version of events." "What would you do?" William asked. There was a long pause. "I would remember that this isn't ultimately about public relations or media management. It's about a son who is in pain and has chosen to express that pain in a very public way. Whether we agree with his methods or not, we need to find a way to respond with love rather than defensiveness." William understood his father's perspective, but he struggled with the practical implications. "And if his way of expressing pain involves continuing to damage the institution we've all dedicated our lives to serving? Then, we have to trust that the institution is strong enough to survive it," Charles replied. "The monarchy has weathered far worse storms than this. But families are more fragile. Whatever we do in response, we need to ensure that there's still a possibility for healing somewhere down the line." After the call, William sat in his study, staring at a photograph from Harry's wedding. It had been such a hopeful day. Harry looked genuinely happy, Meghan seemed radiant, and William had felt optimistic about their future together. In his speech at the reception, he'd welcomed Meghan to the family and expressed his joy at seeing his brother so clearly in love. Now, that same brother was on television describing the family as trapped in a cycle of pain and institutional dysfunction. The woman William had welcomed so warmly was recounting her struggles with mental health and her alleged inability to get help. The hopeful future he'd imagined had transformed into a public relations nightmare that threatened to overshadow years of positive work. William's phone chimed with a text from George's school. The headmaster wanted to schedule a private meeting to discuss how they might handle any questions or comments from other students about the documentary. Even at 9 years old, George was already feeling the impact of his uncle's choices. The next morning brought a new crisis. The Times had published an article featuring anonymous quotes from current and former palace staff, providing their perspective on the support that had been offered to Meghan during her time as a working royal. William hadn't authorized the comments, but clearly someone had decided that the staff's side of the story needed to be told. The article detailed the extensive resources that had been made available: experienced courtiers assigned to help with protocol, mental health professionals recommended through the royal medical team, personal support staff to help with the transition. It painted a picture of an institution that had tried, perhaps imperfectly, to accommodate Meghan's needs while also maintaining necessary protocols and boundaries. But the response was swift and predictable. Harry and Meghan's supporters dismissed the anonymous quotes as palace spin, while their critics pointed to the article as evidence that the Sussexes had been ungrateful for the help they'd received. The story had now evolved into a full-scale war of narratives, with each side presenting evidence to support their version of events. William's communications team was in crisis mode, trying to distance the palace from the unauthorized comments while also managing the fallout. Sarah Mitchell looked exhausted as she briefed William on the morning's developments. "Sir, we need to make a decision about our communications strategy. The story is beginning to take on a life of its own, with more people speaking out on both sides. If we don't provide some form of official response soon, we risk losing control of the narrative entirely." William nodded, understanding the bind they were in. Silence was beginning to look like an admission of guilt, but any response would necessarily involve airing private family matters in public. Either choice carried significant risks. "What are the options?" he asked. "We could issue a statement acknowledging different perspectives while reaffirming our commitment to family unity. We could authorize a more detailed response that addresses specific allegations. Or we could arrange for you to give an interview that puts these claims in broader context." The idea of giving his own interview was both appealing and terrifying. It would allow him to present his perspective directly, to explain the complexities that Harry's documentary had glossed over. But it would also represent a fundamental change in how the royal family handled public disputes, potentially setting a precedent that could complicate future crises.
What would Catherine think? He wondered aloud. Sarah smiled slightly.
She said to remind you that your primary responsibility is to your own family and your own conscience. Whatever choice you make, she'll support. That afternoon, William received an unexpected call from one of his cousins, Princess Anne's son Peter Phillips. Peter had always maintained a more private relationship with the media, despite his royal connections, and his perspective was valuable. "Will, I wanted you to know that those of us who've watched this from the outside can see what really happened," Peter said. Harry was struggling, and, instead of finding ways to work within the system, he chose to blow it up.
"That's not your fault."
The support from family members meant more than William had expected. He'd felt isolated in recent days, unsure whether others shared his frustration with Harry's choices or whether they viewed his own response as inadequate. But the conversation with Peter also highlighted another dimension of the crisis. Harry's documentary hadn't just attacked William or Charles, it had called into question the entire royal family's approach to supporting its members. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and other relatives were all being implicated in a system that Harry characterized as fundamentally broken. That evening, William finally had the conversation with his children that he'd been dreading. He gathered George, Charlotte, and Louis in their sitting room after dinner, with Catherine beside him for support. "You might have heard some grown-ups talking about Uncle Harry and Aunt Meghan lately," he began carefully. "They've made a film where they talk about our family, and some people are discussing it." George, always the most serious of the three, nodded gravely.
"Tommy at school said Uncle Harry thinks we're mean to him."
William's heart clenched at the simplicity of his son's summary. "Sometimes, George, families disagree about things. Uncle Harry feels hurt about some things that happened, and he's decided to share those feelings with lots of people." "But we love Uncle Harry," Charlotte said, clearly confused.
"Why would he say mean things about us?" "He loves us too," William assured her, hoping it was still true. "But sometimes when people are hurt, they say things that hurt other people back. It doesn't mean they don't love each other." Louis, only 4, was less interested in the complex family dynamics than in the practical implications. "Will Uncle Harry come for Christmas?" The question hung in the air. William realized he didn't know the answer. Harry and Meghan had spent the last few years celebrating holidays in California, but there had always been the theoretical possibility of future reunions. Now, after the documentary, William couldn't imagine how they could sit around the same table and pretend everything was normal. "I don't know, Louis," he said honestly. "But we'll still have a wonderful Christmas together." After the children were settled for the night, William and Catherine sat together on their sofa, both emotionally exhausted from the past week's revelations and responses. "What are you thinking?" Catherine asked, curling up beside him. "I'm thinking that I miss my brother," William admitted. "Not the Harry who made that documentary, but the Harry who used to call me when he was having a bad day. The Harry who played with George when he was a baby. The Harry who understood that we were in this together, even when it was difficult." Catherine squeezed his hand. That Harry might still be there, underneath all this anger and publicity. "Maybe," William said. "But I don't know how to reach him anymore. Every conversation now feels like it might end up in the next interview or documentary. How do you have a relationship with someone when you can't trust them?"